He was just a struggling single dad working 3 jobs to keep the lights on. She was a mysterious woman whose 3 young daughters meant everything to her. And when a freak storm turned their quiet lakeside community into a death trap, neither Marcus Wright nor Ivy Carter knew that the desperate rescue that followed would reveal she secretly owned half the city's most valuable properties, or that saving her life would completely transform his. Some stories don't begin with fairy tales. Some start with ordinary people doing extraordinary things when no one is watching. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., but Marcus Wright was already awake. He'd been staring at the water-stained ceiling of his cramped apartment for 20 minutes, calculating numbers that never seemed to add up right. Rent was due in 5 days. His 7-year-old daughter Lily needed new school supplies. The electric company had sent their final notice yesterday, printed in aggressive red letters that seemed to mock him from the kitchen counter. Marcus rolled out of bed, his back protesting from another night on the lumpy mattress he'd been meaning to replace. For 2 years. At 34, he felt like he was carrying the weight of 2 lifetimes. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man who'd aged beyond his years, stubble he didn't have time to shave, dark circles that had become permanent fixtures, and hands that were already calloused from the day's work ahead. But his eyes still held something unbroken, something that refused to give up, no matter how many bills piled up or how many nights he fell asleep, wondering if he was failing as a father. The first job started at 5 a.m. Marcus drove his battered pickup truck through the empty streets of Millbrook Heights, a mid-sized city nestled between rolling hills and Mirror Lake. The town had character, tree-lined streets, historic downtown, the kind of place where people still waved to strangers. It was also expensive, which was why Marcus lived in the part of town where dreams came to struggle. His first stop was Sunrise Diner, where he worked the breakfast shift as a short-order cook. The pay wasn't much, but it came with free meals and the kind of steady routine that kept him grounded. He flipped eggs and grilled bacon while the sun painted the sky in soft pastels, thinking about Lily sleeping safely in her bed, her stuffed elephant tucked under her arm. By 11 a.m., he was across town at Henderson Construction, where he spent his afternoons doing manual labor, hauling materials, digging foundations, whatever needed strong hands and a willingness to sweat. The other guys ribbed him about his soft morning job, but Marcus didn't care. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. The third job was the hardest one to explain. 3 evenings a week, Marcus cleaned offices in the financial district downtown. He'd push a cart through marble lobbies and carpeted hallways, emptying trash, cans and vacuuming floors, while the city's elite had long since gone home to their suburban mansions. Sometimes he'd pause at the floor-to-ceiling windows and look out at the glittering lights of the city, wondering what it would feel like to belong to that world instead of just cleaning up after it. But tonight was different. Tonight, Marcus was taking Lily to the Autumn Festival at Willowbrook Park, one of the few free events in town that didn't make him feel like an outsider looking in. She'd been talking about it for weeks, especially the boat rides on Mirror Lake and the possibility of seeing the evening light show reflected in the water. "Daddy, can we get cotton candy?" Lily asked as they walked through the festival grounds, her small hand tucked securely in his. She wore her favorite dress, the blue one with tiny flowers that his ex-wife had bought before she decided that being a mother was too hard and moved 3 states away without a forwarding address. "We'll see, sweetheart," Marcus said, which was his standard response to requests that required money he didn't have. But when he saw her face light up at the sight of the spinning cotton candy machine, he knew he'd find a way. He always did. The festival was perfect autumn evening material, crisp air, the smell of caramel apples and wood smoke, families laughing together while children ran between the booths with painted faces and balloon animals. Marcus felt the familiar ache of wanting to give Lily more, to be the dad who didn't have to count dollars before buying a $5 bag of spun sugar. They were walking toward the lake when the weather changed. It happened fast, the way mountain storms often do. One moment the sky was clear and painted with sunset colors. The next, dark clouds rolled in like a gray avalanche, and the wind picked up with an urgency that made the festival banners snap and dance. "Folks, we're seeing some severe weather moving in," announced a voice over the crackling loudspeaker. "For your safety, we're asking everyone to move to the community center until this passes." But not everyone heard the announcement, and not everyone had time to react. Marcus was helping Lily put on her jacket when he heard it, screaming, coming from the direction of the lake. Not the playful screams of children on rides, but something else. Something desperate and terrified that cut through the wind like a blade. He looked toward Mirror Lake and saw something that made his blood freeze. A small boat, probably one of the rental rowboats from the dock, was being tossed by waves that had appeared from nowhere. The lake, usually calm as glass, had turned violent in minutes. And in that boat, he could see figures, a woman and what looked like 3 small children, fighting against water that was trying to claim them. The storm had turned Mirror Lake into something unrecognizable. Waves crashed against the usually peaceful shoreline, and the wind howled with a ferocity that sent festival equipment tumbling across the grass. Most people were running toward shelter, but Marcus was running toward the lake. "Daddy, where are you going?" Lily called after him, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. Marcus turned back for just a moment, his heart torn between his daughter's safety and the strangers who were about to drown. An elderly festival volunteer was already reaching for Lily's hand, guiding her toward the community center with other families. "Take care of her," Marcus shouted, and then he was sprinting toward the water, his construction boots splashing through puddles that were forming faster than the ground could absorb them. The boat was maybe 50 yards from shore, but it might as well have been 50 miles. The woman inside was trying to hold on to 3 children, triplets, he realized, all looking to be around 8 or 9 years old. The boat was taking on water, and every wave that hit them pushed them farther from safety. Marcus didn't think. Thinking was a luxury for people who had time to weigh options and calculate risks. He kicked off his boots and dove into Mirror Lake, the cold water hitting him like an electric shock that drove the air from his lungs. The storm had turned the lake into a washing machine. Every stroke was a battle against currents that seemed determined to drag him under. His work clothes became heavy anchors, but he kept swimming, kept fighting toward the boat that was disappearing and reappearing behind walls of churning water. When he finally reached them, the woman's eyes were wide with terror and determination. She was maybe in her early 30s, dark hair plastered against her face, wearing what looked like expensive clothes that were now waterlogged and torn. But what struck Marcus most was her fierce protectiveness, the way she held those 3 little girls like she could will them to safety through sheer love alone. "The boat's sinking!" she shouted over the storm. I can't get them all to shore." Marcus grabbed onto the side of the boat, his lungs burning from the cold and exertion. The 3 girls looked at him with identical expressions of fear and hope. They were definitely triplets with the same dark eyes and delicate features as their mother. "I've got you," Marcus said, though he had no idea how he was going to keep that promise. "All of you, we're getting out of this." What happened next would be burned into his memory forever. Not just the physical struggle of getting 4 people to safety through a storm that seemed intent on drowning them all, but the moment when he looked into that woman's eyes and saw something that would change everything, not just gratitude, but recognition, as if she knew, even in that moment of terror, that their lives were about to become intertwined in ways neither of them could imagine. The rescue that followed would make Marcus Wright a local hero. But the real story, the one about Ivy Carter, and the secret that would transform both their lives, was just beginning. Marcus Wright hadn't always been the kind of man who worked 3 jobs and counted quarters for his daughter's school lunch. There was a time when he'd worn suits to work, when his biggest worry was whether to take the promotion that would mean longer hours but better pay. That was before everything fell apart, before he learned that life could strip away everything you thought was permanent in the span of a single phone call. 3 years ago, Marcus had been a project manager at Millbrook Development Corporation, one of the city's most prestigious construction firms. He'd managed multi-million-dollar residential projects, coordinated teams of architects and contractors, and wore ties that cost more than what he now made in a week. His wife, Jessica, had been a marketing executive at a tech startup, and together they'd built what looked like a perfect life in a perfect house in Millbrook Heights' best neighborhood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They'd been trying for a second baby when the call came. Jessica was pregnant, but there were complications. Severe complications that required months of bed rest, experimental treatments, and medical bills that insurance only partially covered. Marcus had used up all his vacation time, then all his sick leave, caring for his wife and managing Lily, who was only 4 at the time and couldn't understand why Mommy couldn't get out of bed. The baby, a son they'd planned to name David, didn't make it. Jessica survived, but something inside her had broken along with her body. She blamed Marcus for not being strong enough to hold their family together. She blamed herself for not being able to carry their son to term. Most of all, she blamed the life they'd built together for not being enough to protect them from tragedy. The divorce papers came 6 months later, along with Jessica's announcement that she was moving to California to start fresh. She didn't want custody of Lily, said she couldn't handle being a mother right now, maybe not ever. The house went on the market to pay medical bills and legal fees. Marcus's job disappeared when the company downsized, letting go of employees who'd missed too much work for personal reasons. In the span of 18 months, Marcus had lost his son, his wife, his home, his career, and most of his friends. People who didn't know how to act around someone whose perfect life had imploded so spectacularly. He'd been left with Lily, a mountain of debt, and the crushing weight of being solely responsible for a little girl who kept asking when Mommy was coming home. The apartment they lived in now was a far cry from their former suburban paradise. 2 bedrooms, thin walls, and a landlord who fixed things only when absolutely necessary. But it was clean, it was safe, and it was theirs. Marcus had painted Lily's room yellow, her favorite color, and bought her a twin bed with a canopy that made her feel like a princess. He'd sold his expensive watch, his golf clubs, and his collection of first edition books to pay for it. But seeing her smile in that little room made every sacrifice worth it. The 3 jobs weren't ideal, but they were honest work. Marcus had learned to take pride in the simple rhythm of each day. The early morning quiet at the diner when he could think clearly while cooking breakfast for people starting their own daily battles. The physical satisfaction of construction. Work that left him tired but accomplished. The meditative quality of cleaning offices when the city was quiet and he could process the day's challenges. What kept him going was Lily. 7 years old now. With his brown eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, she was the kind of kid who could find joy in cardboard boxes and puddles. She never complained about their small apartment or the fact that they couldn't afford the toys her classmates had. Instead, she'd make up elaborate stories about their adventures, turning grocery shopping into treasure hunts and bedtime into magical journeys to far-off kingdoms. "Daddy," she'd said just last week while they were walking home from the discount. store with generic cereal and marked-down bread. I think we're lucky. Marcus had looked down at her, this fierce little person who'd been through more upheaval than most adults, and asked, "Why's that, sweetheart?" "Because we have each other," she'd said simply, "and because you make the best pancakes in the whole world." He'd carried that conversation with him through every difficult moment since, through the embarrassment of using food stamps at the grocery store, through the late nights when he balanced their meager budget on a calculator that sometimes didn't add up to hope, through the mornings when he looked in the mirror and wondered if he was enough for her. The truth was, Marcus lived in constant fear that he wasn't enough, that someday someone would decide that a single father working 3 jobs and living paycheck to paycheck wasn't fit to raise a little girl, that Lily deserved better than a father who bought her clothes at thrift stores and had to save for weeks to afford a night at the movies. But he also knew something that his old life had never taught him. Love wasn't measured in square footage or salary figures. It was measured in showing up, in staying present, in choosing to fight for what mattered most, even when everything else fell apart. The night of the festival, Marcus had almost stayed home. He was exhausted from pulling a double shift at construction when one of the other guys called in sick. His back ached. His hands were scraped from handling rough lumber, and his bank account was lighter than he'd like after buying Lily the new shoes she'd needed for school. But he'd seen the way her face lit up when she talked about the festival, and he remembered being 7 years old himself, how magical autumn evenings could feel when you were small and the world was full of possibilities. So he'd scraped together enough money for festival parking and maybe a small treat, put on his cleanest shirt, and walked with his daughter through the golden evening light toward Willowbrook Park. He never could have imagined that decision would change everything. That the storm brewing over Mirror Lake would do more than just disrupt a small-town festival. It would reveal that sometimes the people who have the least to give are the ones who give the most. And sometimes the universe has a way of noticing. As Marcus drove his battered pickup truck home that night, his clothes still damp from the lake, Lily sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat, he had no idea that the woman he'd pulled from, the water wasn't just grateful, she was curious. Curious about the man who'd risked everything to save strangers, who'd emerged from that lake not asking for recognition or reward, but simply checking to make sure everyone was okay before disappearing. Back into the crowd, Ivy Carter was a woman who'd built her fortune by recognizing potential where others saw only problems. And something about Marcus Wright had captured her attention in a way that would soon transform both their lives forever. The rescue happened in stages, each one more desperate than the last. When Marcus reached the sinking boat, he realized the situation was worse than it had looked from shore. The small rental rowboat was taking on water faster than anyone could bail it out, and the storm was pushing them farther from the festival lights with each passing second. "Grab onto me!" Marcus shouted to the woman over the howling wind. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd initially thought, maybe early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes that were wide with fear but not panic. Even in the chaos, she maintained a fierce determination that reminded him of Lily when she was trying to solve a difficult puzzle. "I can't leave them," she shouted back, clutching the 3 girls closer to her chest. The triplets were identical. Same dark hair, same delicate features, same expressions of trust, mixed with terror as they looked between their mother and this stranger who'd appeared in their darkest moment. "We're all going together," Marcus said, though he had no idea how he was going to make that promise a reality. The boat lurched violently as another wave crashed over them, and he heard one of the girls cry out, not in fear, but in pain. "Mommy, my arm!" It was the girl on the left, and Marcus could see her wrist was bent at an angle that made his stomach clench. She must have injured it when the boat first started taking on water. The woman, Ivy, though he wouldn't learn her name until Much later, looked at her daughter's injury and then at Marcus, with an expression he recognized. It was the same look he'd seen in his own mirror during those terrible months when Jessica was sick, and he'd known that everything depended on decisions he wasn't sure he was strong enough to make. "Take her first," Ivy said, nodding toward the injured girl. "Please, I can hold on to the boat with the other two until you come back." Marcus looked at the sinking boat, at the storm that was getting worse by the minute, at the three identical faces staring up at him with absolute faith that somehow he would save them all. The practical part of his mind, the part that had learned to calculate odds and manage risks, told him that making multiple trips in these conditions was suicide. But the part of him that was a father, that understood what it meant to love someone more than your own life, knew there was no other choice. "What's her name?" he asked, reaching for the injured girl. "Sophie," Ivy called out as Marcus lifted the girl into his arms. She was lighter than Lily, all bones and frightened breathing, but she held on to him with the fierce grip of someone who understood that this stranger was her lifeline. "Sophie, I need you to hold on tight and don't let go, no matter what happens," Marcus said directly to her. "Can you do that for me?" She nodded, her dark eyes serious despite the pain he knew she must be feeling. "Are you going to save my sisters too?" "I promise," Marcus said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The swim back to shore with Sophie was a nightmare of churning water and burning lungs. Marcus had to fight not just the storm, but his own exhaustion and the growing cold that was seeping into his bones. Sophie held on exactly as he'd asked, never loosening her grip even when waves crashed over their heads and salt water filled their mouths. When they finally reached the shallows, festival volunteers were waiting with blankets and first aid supplies. Marcus handed Sophie to a paramedic and immediately turned back toward the lake, ignoring the voices calling for him to wait, to let the professionals handle it, to think about his own safety. But when he looked out at the water, his heart nearly stopped. The boat was gone. For a terrible moment, Marcus thought he was too late. Then he saw them, three figures clinging to an overturned hull about 70 yards from shore, farther out than they'd been before. The storm had pushed them into deeper water, and without the boat's limited shelter, they were completely exposed to the elements. Marcus dove back into Mirror Lake without hesitation. This time, the swim was harder. His muscles were already exhausted, his clothes were waterlogged, and the cold was affecting his coordination. But he could see Ivy holding onto her two remaining daughters, and he knew that every second counted. When he reached them, Ivy was barely keeping her head above water. She'd positioned herself so that both girls could hold onto the overturned boat while she tread water beside them, taking the full brunt of the waves that crashed over the hull. "I've got them," Marcus gasped as he reached the group. One of the remaining girls, he'd learn later that her name was Grace, immediately reached for him with the same trust her sister had shown. "I can swim," Ivy said through chattering teeth. "Take Grace. I'll swim beside you with Emma." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he could somehow manage all three of them at once, but he could see the exhaustion in Ivy's eyes and knew they were all running out of time. The storm was getting worse and hypothermia was becoming a real threat. The swim back was the longest of Marcus's life. Grace held on to him with quiet courage while he fought against currents that seemed determined to drag them all under. Beside him, Ivy swam with Emma, the two of them struggling against water that was rough enough to challenge an experienced swimmer, let alone a woman who was already exhausted from keeping her daughters alive. Halfway to shore, Marcus heard Emma cry out. A wave had separated her from her mother, and she was flailing in the water, too panicked to remember how to swim. Without thinking, Marcus reached for her while still holding Grace, and for a terrifying moment, all three of them went under. They surfaced together, gasping and coughing, and Marcus realized he couldn't manage both girls and stay afloat. was going to have to make an impossible choice, or they were all going to drown. That's when he felt a hand on his shoulder. Ivy had somehow found the strength to swim to them, and without a word, she took Emma while Marcus focused on Grace. Together, they made the final push towards shore, their movements synchronized by desperation and determination. When they finally reached the shallows, Marcus's legs gave out. He collapsed in knee-deep water, still holding Grace, while festival volunteers rushed to help them all onto dry land. He was dimly aware of blankets being wrapped around him, of paramedics checking his vital signs, of someone asking his name and if he was hurt. But all he could focus on was the sight of Ivy Carter sitting on the muddy shore, holding all three of her daughters against her chest while they cried and shivered and clung to her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had tried to wash them away. That's when it hit him, the magnitude of what had just happened. 4 people who had been minutes away from drowning were alive. 3 little girls would go home to their beds tonight instead of becoming a tragedy that haunted a small town forever. And he, Marcus Wright, who'd spent the last 3 years feeling like he was failing at everything that mattered, had somehow managed to be exactly where he needed to be at exactly the right moment. As the paramedics checked him for signs of hypothermia and exhaustion, Marcus caught Ivy's eye across the chaos of emergency responders and concerned festival goers. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but something else too. Something that felt almost like recognition, as if she was seeing him not just as the man who'd saved her family, but as someone whose story was somehow connected to hers in ways neither of them understood yet. "Thank you," she mouthed silently across the distance between them. Marcus nodded, too exhausted for words. But as they were both loaded into separate ambulances for precautionary medical checks, he found himself wondering about the woman with the fierce eyes and the 3 daughters who trusted completely in her ability to keep them safe. He wondered what had brought them to Mirror Lake that night, why they'd been in a boat during a storm, and most of all, why he couldn't shake the feeling that this rescue was just the beginning of something much larger than either of them could imagine. Neither Marcus nor Ivy knew it yet, but their lives had just become intertwined in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about fate, fortune, and the strange mathematics of kindness. The storm had brought them together, but the real transformation was still to come. The local news coverage lasted exactly 48 hours. "Local hero saves family from lake storm," read the headline in the Millbrook Heights Gazette, accompanied by a grainy photo of Marcus being helped onto shore by paramedics. The article was brief, 3 paragraphs that reduced the most terrifying and extraordinary night of his life to a simple human interest story about a good Samaritan who'd risked his life to save strangers. Marcus hated every word of it, not because the coverage was inaccurate, but because it made him feel like a fraud. The article painted him as some kind of everyday hero, a man who'd calmly assessed a dangerous situation and made a calculated decision to help. But that wasn't how it had felt in the moment. It had felt like panic, like desperation, like the raw animal instinct of someone who couldn't bear to watch others suffer when he had the power to do something about it. The reporter had tried to interview him at the hospital, but Marcus had declined. He'd given a brief statement to the police, name, address, description of events, and then asked to be left alone. The last thing he wanted was attention, especially the kind that made people look at him like he was some kind of saint instead of just a man who'd done what needed to be done. But the attention came anyway. For 3 days, his phone rang constantly. Local radio stations wanted interviews. The morning show at Channel 7 left voicemails asking if he'd appear on their Hometown Heroes segment. A woman from the mayor's office called to ask if he'd accept a commendation at the next city council meeting. Marcus ignored them all. He went to work at the diner, deflected questions from curious customers, and tried to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything felt different now. The familiar routines that had anchored his life for 3 years, the early morning drives, the rhythm of cooking breakfast, the simple satisfaction of honest work, all of it felt somehow hollow, like he was going through the motions of a life that no longer quite fit. The worst part was the way people looked at him now. At the construction site, his co-workers treated him with a new kind of respect that made him uncomfortable. They called him hero and slapped his back and told stories about the rescue that got more dramatic with each telling. At the diner, regular customers left bigger tips and tried to engage him in conversations about courage and selflessness that made him want to hide in the kitchen. Even Lily seemed different around him. She'd always looked at him with the uncomplicated adoration that daughters have for their fathers. But now there was something else in her eyes, a kind of awe that made him feel like he was disappointing her just by being himself. "Daddy," she'd asked 3 days after the rescue, "are you famous now?" They were sitting at their small kitchen table, sharing a dinner of spaghetti and jarred sauce, the same meal they ate twice a week because it was cheap and filling, and Lily loved twirling the noodles around her fork. "No, sweetheart," Marcus had said. "I'm just the same person I always was." But Lily had tilted her head in that way that meant she was thinking hard about something. "Tommy's mom said you're a hero. She said you saved a whole family from drowning." Marcus had set down his fork, suddenly unable to eat. "I just helped some people who needed help." "That's what we do for each other, right? That's what you'd do too." "But not everyone would jump in a scary lake," Lily had said matter-of-factly. "Tommy's mom said most people would just call 911 and wait." That conversation had haunted Marcus for days. Not because he disagreed with what people were saying about the rescue, but because he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was missing the point. The story wasn't about him being brave or heroic. The story was about 4 people who'd almost died, and the strange series of coincidences that had put him in the right place at the right time to prevent that tragedy. But as the days passed and the attention faded, Marcus found himself thinking more and more about the woman he'd pulled from the water. Ivy Carter. He'd learned her name from the brief mention in the newspaper article. The piece had said she was a local businesswoman who'd been taking her daughters on a boat ride when the storm hit. It mentioned that all 4 had been treated for hypothermia and released from the hospital the same night. That was it. No follow-up interview, no quotes from her about the rescue, no additional information about who she was or why she'd been on the lake that evening. It was as if she'd deliberately avoided the media attention that Marcus had been trying so hard to escape. He found himself wondering about her during the quiet moments at work. What kind of business did she run? Was she married? Where did she live? How were her daughters recovering from their ordeal? He had questions he couldn't answer and no reasonable way to find out the answers. The strangest part was how the rescue had affected his relationship with water itself. Marcus had never been afraid of swimming. He'd been a decent swimmer in high school, comfortable enough in pools and calm lakes. But now, every time he drove past Mirror Lake on his way to work, he felt a tightness in his chest that hadn't been there before. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like a heightened awareness, as if the water was watching him back. Sometimes he'd pull over at the scenic overlook and sit in his truck, staring out at the lake that looked so peaceful in the daylight, trying to reconcile the tranquil surface with the violent chaos he remembered from that night. 2 weeks after the rescue, Marcus was cleaning offices in the financial district when he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. He was emptying trash cans on the 15th floor of the Millbrook Tower when he glanced out the floor-to-ceiling windows and saw the city spread out below him like a glittering map. The view was spectacular, the kind of vista that people paid thousands of dollars to wake up to every morning. But what caught his attention wasn't the beauty of the scene. It was the realization of how much of what he was looking at belonged to someone else. The gleaming office buildings, the luxury condominiums, the shopping centers and restaurants, all of it owned by people who lived in a completely different world from his own. Standing there with a trash bag in his hand, wearing the uniform of invisible labor, Marcus felt the weight of his own circumstances in a way that was both familiar and newly acute. He'd rescued 4 people from drowning, but he was still the same man who worked 3 jobs to pay rent on a 2-bedroom apartment. He was still counting quarters for his daughter's school supplies and choosing between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. The rescue hadn't changed his life. It had just reminded him of how unchangeable his life actually was. That night, as he was tucking Lily into bed, she asked him a question that cut straight to the heart of what he'd been feeling. "Daddy, do you think the lady you saved will remember you?" Marcus smoothed the covers around her shoulders, considering his answer. "I think she'll remember what happened that night, but I don't think she'll remember me specifically. I was just someone who happened to be there." Lily frowned. "But you weren't just someone, you were you. You were the person who jumped in the scary water when everyone else was running away." Marcus kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of the strawberry shampoo he bought in bulk at the discount store. "Sometimes being yourself is enough, sweetheart, even if no one remembers your name." But as he turned off her light and walked back to his own bedroom, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Lily was wrong about one thing. He had a strange, persistent sense that Ivy Carter would remember him. Not because he was particularly memorable, but because something had passed between them in those terrible moments on the lake. Something that felt too significant to be forgotten. What he didn't know was that Ivy Carter was having her own sleepless nights, her own questions about the man who'd appeared out of nowhere to save her family. And unlike Marcus, she had the resources to find answers to those questions. The doubt and isolation he was feeling was about to be interrupted in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The transformation was coming, but first, Marcus had to finish learning how to live with the weight of his own heroism. 3 weeks after the rescue, Marcus was working his usual shift at Henderson Construction when his supervisor, a gruff man named Dale, who'd been building houses since before Marcus was born, approached him with an expression that was equal parts confused and impressed. "Right," Dale called out over the noise of power tools and machinery. "Someone's here to see you." Marcus looked up from the foundation he'd been helping to pour, his hands covered in concrete dust and his shirt soaked with sweat. It was barely past noon on a Tuesday, which meant he still had 4 hours left on this shift before he'd need to clean up and head to his evening job at the office building. "Who is it?" Marcus asked, wiping his hands on his work pants. Dale shrugged. "Some woman in a fancy car says it's about the lake thing." He gestured toward the construction site's entrance, where Marcus could see a sleek, black Mercedes parked next to the chain-link fence that separated the work zone from the street. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He'd managed to avoid most of the media attention following the rescue, but every few days, someone would track him down, a local blogger wanting to write a follow-up story, a photographer hoping to get a picture of the lake hero at work, or occasionally someone from a neighboring town who'd heard about the incident and wanted to shake his hand. He walked toward the entrance, already preparing his polite but firm decline of whatever interview or photo opportunity was being offered. But as he got closer to the Mercedes, he realized that the woman standing beside it wasn't holding a camera or a notepad. She was holding a manila envelope, and her posture suggested she was nervous about something. It took him a moment to recognize her. Without the storm, without the terror in her eyes, without her hair plastered against her face by lake water, Ivy Carter looked completely different. She was wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, and her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek bun that spoke of professional stylists and morning routines he couldn't imagine. But her eyes were the same, intelligent, intense, and now focused on him, with an expression that made him feel like she was seeing straight through to something he wasn't sure he wanted her to find. "Mr. Wright," she said, extending her hand, with the kind of confident gesture that suggested she was used to commanding attention in boardrooms and business meetings. "I'm Ivy Carter. I don't know if you remember me, but—" "I remember," Marcus said, shaking her hand and noting that her grip was firm, but her fingers were trembling slightly. "How are your daughters? Are they okay?" Something in Ivy's expression softened at the question. "They're fine. Sophie's wrist healed perfectly, and all three of them are back to their normal routines. Swimming lessons, actually," she added with a small smile. "They insisted." Marcus nodded, feeling some of the tension in his chest ease. "That's good. That's really good." They stood there for a moment, two people who'd shared an extraordinary experience but had no framework for how to talk about it in the ordinary world. Around them, the construction site hummed with activity. Workers calling to each other, the beep of machinery backing up, the rhythmic sound of hammers against wood. It was Marcus's world, familiar and predictable. But with Ivy standing there in her expensive suit, it suddenly felt small and exposed. "I wanted to thank you properly," Ivy said, holding up the manila envelope. "What you did that night, I can't imagine what would have happened if you hadn't been there." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Marcus said automatically. The response he'd been giving for 3 weeks whenever someone brought up the rescue. Ivy's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with something that looked like disappointment. "No," she said firmly, "they wouldn't have. I've been thinking about that night a lot, Mr. Wright, and I keep coming back to the same question. What kind of person sees strangers in danger and doesn't hesitate to risk everything to help them?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, aware that some of his co-workers had stopped what they were doing and were watching the conversation with obvious curiosity. Dale was pretending to check inventory on a clipboard, but Marcus could tell he was listening to every word. "I just did what needed to be done," Marcus said. "I'm glad your family is okay, but you don't need to thank me. Really." "Actually, I do," Ivy said, and there was something in her voice that made Marcus look at her more carefully. "Because I've learned some things about you in the past few weeks, Mr. Wright. Things that make what you did even more remarkable than I initially thought." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, Ivy opened the manila envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Marcus could see it was some kind of official document, but he couldn't make out the details from where he was standing. "I know you work 3 jobs," Ivy said quietly. "I know you're raising your daughter alone. I know you lost your house and your career a few years ago because of medical bills and family circumstances that were completely beyond your control." She paused, watching his expression carefully. "And I know that despite all of that, when you saw my family in danger, you didn't think about your own safety or your own responsibilities. You didn't think about the fact that you have a 7-year-old daughter who depends on you completely. You just acted." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Who told you?" "It doesn't matter how I found out," Ivy said gently. "What matters is that I understand now what kind of person you are. And I understand what I almost lost that night wasn't just my life and my daughter's lives. I almost lost the chance to know someone who defines the word integrity in a way that most people only talk about but never actually live." She held out the document, and Marcus saw that it was a cashier's check. His eyes moved to the amount line, and he had to read it 3 times before his brain could process what he was seeing. $50,000. "I can't take this," Marcus said immediately, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. This is too much. It's a small token of gratitude from someone who has more money than she knows what to do with, given to someone who has more character than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Ivy interrupted. Please don't insult me by refusing it. Marcus stared at the check, his mind racing. $50,000 would change everything. It would pay off his debts, give him breathing room to maybe cut back to 2 jobs instead of 3, allow him to buy Lily the things she needed without calculating every dollar. It would transform his life in ways he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine. But it also felt wrong somehow, like he was being paid for something that shouldn't have a price. Tag. I didn't save your family for money, he said finally. I saved them because it was the right thing to do. Taking payment for that feels like it changes what happened. Ivy studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that she was measuring him against some internal standard he wasn't aware of. Mr. Wright, she said finally, can I ask you something? When you jumped into that lake, were you thinking about being noble? Were you thinking about setting an example or proving your character or making yourself feel good about the kind of person you are? Marcus frowned, trying to remember those chaotic moments. No, I was thinking about your daughters. I was thinking that they were going to die if someone didn't help them. Exactly, Ivy said with satisfaction. You acted out of pure compassion, without any thought of reward or recognition. That's exactly why you deserve to be rewarded. She pressed the check into his hands. This isn't payment for services rendered, Mr. Wright. This is an investment in the kind of person who makes the world a better place just by existing in it. Marcus looked down at the check, then back at Ivy's face. There was something in her expression that he couldn't quite read. Determination, certainly, but also something that looked almost like hope. Why does this matter so much to you? He asked. Ivy was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than it had been. Because I've spent most of my adult life in a world where people do good things for publicity, for tax breaks, for networking opportunities. I've become cynical about human nature, Mr. Wright, but what you did that night, jumping into a dangerous lake to save complete strangers, refusing interviews, trying to avoid attention, it reminded me that there are still people who do the right thing simply because it's right. And those people shouldn't have to struggle to keep the lights on while they're busy making the world better for everyone else. She stepped back toward her car, then turned back one more time. Cash the check, Mr. Wright. Use it to give your daughter the stability she deserves. And maybe, if you're willing, let me take you and Lily to dinner sometime. I'd like my daughters to meet the man who saved their lives, and I think they'd like to meet Lily too. As Ivy drove away in her Mercedes, Marcus stood in the construction site parking lot, holding a check that represented more money than he'd seen in one place since before his life fell apart. Around him, his co-workers had returned to their tasks, but he could feel their curious glances and knew that word of this encounter would spread through the site within the hour. But for the first time in 3 weeks, Marcus didn't care about the attention. Because Ivy Carter had given him something more valuable than money, she'd given him confirmation that the rescue hadn't been meaningless, that his instinct to help hadn't been foolish, and that sometimes the universe did notice. When people tried to do the right thing, the transformation was beginning. Though Marcus didn't yet understand how completely his life was about to change. The dinner invitation came 3 days later, delivered in the form of a handwritten note that arrived at Marcus's apartment building in an envelope made of paper so thick and creamy it felt expensive to the touch. Lily found it slipped under their door when she got home from school, and she carried it to Marcus like it was treasure. "Daddy, look! Someone sent us a fancy letter." Marcus was in the kitchen, trying to stretch a can of soup and half a loaf of bread into something that would qualify as dinner for both of them. The check from Ivy was still folded in his wallet. He hadn't been able to bring himself to cash it yet, though he'd looked at it approximately 50 times in the past 3 days, still barely believing it was real. The note was written in elegant handwriting on personal stationery with IC embossed at the top in subtle gold lettering. Mr. Wright, if you and Lily are available this Saturday evening, my daughters and I would be honored to have you join us for dinner at our home. Nothing formal, just a chance for our families to meet properly under less dramatic circumstances than our first encounter. Please don't feel obligated to accept. I know you value your privacy, and I don't want to impose on your time with Lily. But if you're willing, I think it would mean a great deal to Sophie, Grace, and Emma to thank you in person for what you did. The girls have been asking about you and wondering if you have children of your own. I told them you have a daughter about their age, and they're very excited about the possibility of meeting her. If Saturday works for you, we'll expect you at 6 p.m. My address is enclosed. With gratitude, Ivy Carter. Below the note was a small piece of paper with an address in Millbrook Heights that made Marcus do a double take. He knew the neighborhood. It was the most exclusive area in the city, where houses started at $1 million and went up from there. He'd driven through those streets occasionally during his days at Millbrook Development, usually to oversee high-end construction projects for clients he'd never actually met. "What does it say, Daddy?" Lily asked, bouncing on her toes with curiosity. Marcus read the note again, trying to process the implications. Ivy Carter lived in a world so far removed from his own that they might as well have been on different planets. Her casual mention of our home probably referred to some mansion with more bedrooms than his entire apartment building had units. "The lady I helped at the lake wants to have dinner with us," Marcus said carefully. "She has 3 daughters about your age, and they want to meet you." Lily's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that only 7-year-olds could generate. "Really? Can we go? What are their names? Do they like horses?" "I hope they like horses." Marcus smiled despite his reservations. Lily had been begging for play dates with classmates, but most of the other parents in her school lived in a different economic bracket than Marcus did. Birthday parties and social gatherings often came with expenses he couldn't afford. Expensive gifts, restaurant meals, activities that required admission fees. He'd learned to make polite excuses that protected both his pride and his budget. But this felt different. This felt like an opportunity to give Lily something he'd been unable to provide. The chance to make friends with other kids without the weight of financial worry hanging over the experience. "We can go," Marcus said, and Lily squealed with delight, hugging him around the waist with the fierce joy that made every struggle worthwhile. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made everything feel possible. Marcus had agonized over what to wear, finally settling on his one good pair of khaki pants and a button-down shirt that he usually reserved for parent-teacher conferences. Lily wore her favorite dress, the blue one with flowers, and insisted on carrying a small bouquet of dandelions she'd picked from the patch of weeds beside their apartment building. "For the lady who almost drowned," she explained seriously. "Flowers make people feel better when they're sad." The drive to Ivy's house took them through neighborhoods that grew progressively more affluent with each turn. The houses got larger, the lawns more manicured, the cars in the driveways more expensive. By the time they reached Ivy's street, Marcus felt like they were traveling through a magazine spread about how the other half lived. Ivy's house wasn't the largest on the block, but it was impressive enough to make Marcus grip the steering wheel a little tighter. It was a stately colonial with white columns and perfectly maintained landscaping, the kind of place that whispered, "Old money and established family." A circular driveway led to a front entrance that looked like it belonged in a movie about people who summered in the Hamptons. "Wow," Lily breathed as they pulled up to the house. "It's like a castle." Marcus parked his battered pickup truck next to a BMW and a Range Rover, acutely aware of how out of place his vehicle looked in this setting. But before he could spiral too deeply into self-consciousness, the front door opened and 3 identical girls came running out, followed by Ivy. The triplets looked completely different than they had that night on the lake. Clean, dry, and glowing. With health, they were dressed in matching outfits that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly grocery budget. But their expressions were exactly what he remembered: open, trusting, and now filled with excitement rather than terror. "Are you Mr. Wright?" the girl on the left asked. "Sophie," he remembered, the one with the injured wrist. "Are you the one who saved us?" Before Marcus could answer, Lily stepped forward with her bouquet of dandelions, her natural social confidence on full display. "Hi, I'm Lily. My daddy said you almost got drowned, so I brought you flowers." The ice was broken instantly. The triplets gathered around Lily, admiring her bouquet and bombarding her with questions about everything from her favorite color to whether she had any pets. Within minutes, the 4 girls were deep in conversation about horses, art projects, and the relative merits of different types of candy. "They're naturals," Ivy said softly, appearing at Marcus's side as they watched the children interact. "I was worried they might be shy after what happened, but they seem completely comfortable with Lily." Marcus looked at Ivy properly for the first time since arriving. She was dressed more casually than she had been at the construction site: jeans and a cream-colored sweater that looked expensive but approachable. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she seemed more relaxed, more like a regular mom than the intimidating businesswoman who'd appeared at his workplace with a $50,000 check. "Lily's always been good with other kids," Marcus said. "She's been asking for siblings since she learned to talk." Something flickered across Ivy's expression, a shadow that was there and gone so quickly, Marcus almost missed it. "It must be hard raising her alone." "Sometimes," Marcus admitted, "but she makes it easier than it should be. He paused, searching for the right words. "She's the reason I get up every morning, the reason everything else makes sense." Ivy nodded, and Marcus had the feeling she understood exactly what he meant. "I know that feeling. After their father died, the girls became my entire world. Everything I do, every decision I make, it's all about giving them the best life possible." Marcus felt a jolt of surprise. "I'm sorry. I didn't know you were widowed." 3 years ago, Ivy said simply. "Cancer. He fought it for 2 years, but..." She shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both acceptance and ongoing grief. The girls were only 5 when he died. They barely remember him, which is probably a blessing and a tragedy at the same time. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their daughters laugh together over something that was apparently hilarious to 8-year-olds. Marcus felt a strange sense of recognition, as if he was looking at a mirror image of his own life reflected back at him through completely different circumstances. "Is that why you were on the lake that night?" he asked gently. "Some kind of memorial?" Ivy's smile was soft and sad. "It was the anniversary of his death. We go there every year. It was his favorite place in the city. He used to take the girls fishing there when they were tiny." She paused. "We were supposed to go earlier in the day, but I got caught up in work meetings. By the time we got to the lake, it was almost evening, and I should have known better than to take them out in a boat so late. If you hadn't been there..." "But I was there," Marcus said firmly. "That's what matters." Ivy looked at him with an expression that was becoming familiar, that sense of her seeing something in him that he didn't quite see in himself. "You know, most people would have asked about my business by now, about the house, about how I can afford to give away $50,000 checks. You haven't asked a single question about any of that." Marcus shrugged. "It's not my business. What matters is that you're a good mother who loves her daughters and almost lost them. Everything else is just details." "See?" Ivy said with a smile that transformed her entire face. "That's exactly what I mean. Most people I know would be calculating my net worth by now and figuring out how to leverage our acquaintance into some kind of business opportunity. I'm not most people you know, Marcus said. No, Ivy agreed. You're definitely not. And that's exactly why I think we're going to be very good friends, Marcus Wright. As if summoned by her words, the four girls came running over, Lily leading, the charge with her new best friends in tow. Daddy, can Sophie and Grace and Emma come to our house next time? Lily asked breathlessly. I want to show them my room and my stuffed animals and the picture you drew of us on the refrigerator. Marcus looked at Ivy, who was smiling with genuine warmth. I think that sounds like a wonderful idea, she said. Though I should warn you, my girls have very high standards when it comes to stuffed animal collections. That's okay, Lily said, confidently. Mr. Elephant is pretty amazing. He's been to the moon 6 times and he knows how to make pancakes. As the evening continued with dinner around Ivy's massive dining room table, Marcus began to understand that he hadn't just gained a friend, he'd found someone who understood the particular challenges and joys of single parenthood in a way that most people couldn't. Someone who, despite their vastly different circumstances, shared his fundamental values about what mattered most in life. The alliance that was forming between them would prove to be more significant than either of them could imagine. Because Ivy Carter had much more to offer than friendship and gratitude, and Marcus Wright was about to discover that sometimes the people you save end up being the ones who transform your entire world. 2 weeks after their dinner at Ivy's house, Marcus was beginning to understand that his new friendship came with complications he hadn't anticipated. Not bad complications, quite the opposite, but the kind of life changes that made him question everything he thought he knew about his own limitations and possibilities. It started with small things. Lily came home from their second play date at Ivy's house, bubbling with stories about the Triplets' bedrooms. Each one has their own bathroom, Daddy, and Grace has a bookshelf that goes all the way to the ceiling. Their backyard, there's a swimming pool and a trampoline and a garden where they grow actual vegetables. And their after-school activities, they take piano lessons and horseback, riding and something called fencing, which isn't about fixing broken fences, it's about sword fighting. Marcus listened to these reports with a mixture of joy and concern. Joy because Lily was happier than he'd seen her in months, practically glowing with the excitement of having found not just one friend, but 3 sisters who treated her like she'd always been part of their group. Concern because he was starting to realize just how vast the gulf was between his world and Ivy's, and he wasn't sure how to navigate that difference without disappointing his daughter. The concern deepened when Lily started asking questions. Daddy, why don't we have a pool? Why can't I take piano lessons like Sophie? Emma's mum bought her a horse for her birthday. Do you think I could have a horse? Marcus answered these questions with the same patient explanations he'd been giving for years. That different families had different amounts of money, that they were lucky to have each other and a safe place to live, that experiences and relationships mattered more than things. Lily accepted these answers with the resilience that had always amazed him, but Marcus could see her processing the disparities in a way that made his heart ache. The tipping point came on a Thursday evening when Marcus was working his shift at the office building downtown. He was emptying trash cans on the 20th floor when his phone buzzed with a text from Ivy. Emergency at work. Could you possibly pick up the girls from school and watch them until I get home? I'll pay you for your time, of course. I know it's short notice. Marcus stared at the message, his mind racing. He was scheduled to work until 9 p.m., and leaving early would mean losing a significant portion of his weekly income. But the text had said, emergency, and he could hear the desperation beneath Ivy's carefully polite words. He called his supervisor and explained the situation, asking if he could make up the hours later in the week. Then he drove to Millbrook Academy, the private school where the triplets were students, to find 4 little girls waiting anxiously by the main entrance. The drive back to Ivy's house was filled with chatter about their day, but Marcus found himself studying the school in his rearview mirror. It was the kind of institution that looked more like a small college than an elementary school. Red brick buildings, manicured grounds, and a tuition that probably cost more than his annual rent. At Ivy's house, the girls immediately launched into their afternoon routine with the kind of structured schedule that spoke of careful planning and abundant resources. Sophie had violin practice in the music room, a dedicated space with a baby, grand piano and professional quality acoustics. Grace had art supplies waiting for her in what Ivy called the craft room, but which looked to Marcus like a fully equipped art studio. Emma disappeared into the library, an actual library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a rolling ladder, to work on a book report. And Lily followed each of her new friends from activity to activity, her eyes wide with wonder at the casual abundance that surrounded her. Marcus sat in Ivy's kitchen, ostensibly supervising homework, but actually marveling at the casual luxury of his surroundings. The kitchen alone was larger than his entire apartment, with granite countertops, professional-grade appliances, and a walk-in pantry stocked with food that represented more variety than Marcus typically bought in a month. When Ivy finally arrived, home at 7 p.m., she looked frazzled in a way that surprised him. Her usually perfect hair was mussed, her expensive suit was wrinkled, and she had the slightly wild-eyed expression of someone who'd been dealing with crisis management all day. "I'm so sorry," she said immediately upon seeing Marcus. "The emergency lasted much longer than I expected. There was a problem with one of our major developments, a structural issue that could have shut down the entire project. I had to coordinate with engineers, contractors, lawyers." She trailed off, seeming to realize she was rambling. "How were the girls?" "Perfect," Marcus said honestly. "They did their homework, had snacks, and Lily had the time of her life getting a tour of your house." Again, Ivy smiled, but Marcus could see the exhaustion behind it. "Let me write you a check for watching them. What's your usual rate for childcare?" "I don't have a usual rate," Marcus said. "I was happy to help. That's what friends do." "Marcus," Ivy said with a firmness that suggested this wasn't negotiable, "you left work early to help me out of a jam. You lost income because of my emergency. Please let me compensate you for that." Before Marcus could argue further, Ivy had pulled out her checkbook and was writing with the kind of efficient movements that suggested she was used to solving problems with money. When she handed him the check, Marcus saw that she'd written it for $500. "This is too much," he said automatically. "Way too much. I was here for 3 hours." "It's not payment for childcare," Ivy said. "It's payment for peace of mind. Do you know what it means to a single mother to know that there's someone she can call in an emergency? Someone she trusts completely with the most important people in her life?" Marcus stared at the check, feeling the familiar discomfort that came with Ivy's generosity. "I can't keep taking money from you. It doesn't feel right." Ivy sat down across from him at her kitchen island, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter, more personal than he'd heard it before. "Marcus, can I tell you something? Something I haven't told anyone else?" He nodded, tucking the check into his shirt pocket without looking at it again. "When David, my husband, was dying, I made him a promise. I promised him that I would use every resource at my disposal to make sure our daughters grew up surrounded by good people, people with integrity, kindness, and strength of character." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "David came from money, but he never forgot what it was like to struggle. His family lost everything when he was young, and he spent his teenage years working multiple jobs to help support his parents and younger siblings. He never wanted the girls to grow up entitled or isolated from the real world." Marcus listened without interrupting, sensing that this was important. "The truth is," Ivy continued, "most of the people in my social circle are, well, they're nice enough, but they're not the kind of people David would have wanted the girls to learn from. They're not the kind of people who would jump into a dangerous lake to save strangers. They're not the kind of people who work 3 jobs to support their families and still find time to be patient, loving fathers." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes intent on his face. "You think I'm being generous with money, but from my perspective, you're being generous with something much more valuable. You're sharing your character with my daughters. You're showing them what it looks like when someone lives with integrity, when someone makes sacrifices for the people they love, when someone chooses to do the right thing, even when it's difficult." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, not the discomfort he'd been feeling about Ivy's financial gifts, but a recognition of something deeper. "The girls talk about you constantly," Ivy went on. "Not just about the rescue, but about the way you interact with Lily. The way you listen when she talks, the way you make pancakes on Saturday mornings, the way you taught her to tie her shoes by practicing with them for hours until she got it right. Sophie, Grace, and Emma have never seen that kind of patient, present fatherhood. Their own father was wonderful, but he was sick for so long that they remember him more as someone who needed taking care of than someone who took care of them." Marcus thought about the triplets, their obvious love for their mother, their confidence and kindness, their easy acceptance of Lily despite the differences in their circumstances. "They seem like they're doing pretty well to me," he said. "They are," Ivy agreed, "but they're missing something that I can't give them no matter how much money I have. They're missing the example of what good men look like, what good fathers look like." She reached across the kitchen island and placed her hand over his. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. When I give you these checks, when I insist on paying you for your time, it's not charity, it's not pity. It's an investment in the most important project of my life, raising 3 daughters who understand that character matters more than wealth, that kindness is more valuable than success, and that the best people in the world are often the ones who have the least to give, but give it anyway." Marcus looked down at their joined hands, processing what she'd just told him. When he looked back up, he saw something in Ivy's expression that made him realize this conversation was about more than just childcare arrangements and financial compensation. "What exactly are you asking me?" he said quietly. Ivy took a deep breath. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me help level the playing field a little bit, not just with these small checks, but with something bigger. Something that would give you the kind of security that would let you be the father you want to be, without having to work yourself to exhaustion just to keep the lights on." She paused, and Marcus could see her weighing her words carefully. "I'm asking if you'd let me offer you a job, Marcus. A real job, with a real salary, doing something that would use your skills and experience instead of just your physical labor." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of the girls laughing. Somewhere in the house, Marcus felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, like everything he thought he understood about his life and his limitations had suddenly been called into question. "What kind of job?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. Ivy smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, Marcus saw something that looked almost like nervousness in her expression. "That," she said, "is where things get really interesting. The job offer came with an address and a meeting time, but no other details." Ivy had been deliberately vague, saying only that she wanted to show Marcus something that would explain her new proposal better than words could. She'd asked him to meet her at 10 a.m. on Saturday morning at 1247 Commerce Street, dressed business casual and prepared to spend a few hours learning about what she did for a living. Marcus had spent the week oscillating between excitement and anxiety. He'd looked up the address and discovered it was in the heart of Millbrook Heights Financial District, in a gleaming office tower that housed some of the city's most prestigious businesses. The building directory included law firms, investment companies, and corporate headquarters for organizations he'd heard of, but never imagined he'd have reason to visit. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made everything seem possible. Marcus had borrowed a tie from his neighbor and spent 20 minutes making sure his one good suit looked presentable. As he drove toward downtown, he found himself thinking about the last time he'd dressed up for a business meeting. It had been more than 3 years ago, during his final interview at Millbrook Development Corporation, back when he'd still believed his career was salvageable. The lobby of 1247 Commerce Street was everything Marcus had expected. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that suggested important decisions were made here on a daily basis. He approached the reception desk feeling simultaneously nervous and underdressed, despite his careful attention to his appearance. "I'm here to see Ivy Carter," he told the receptionist, a professionally polished woman who looked like she could have been a model in a previous life. "Mr. Wright?" she asked with a smile that suggested she'd been expecting him. "Ms. Carter is waiting for you in the penthouse. Take the elevator to the 42nd floor." The elevator ride seemed to last forever, giving Marcus time to wonder what exactly he was walking into. When the doors finally opened, he found himself in a reception area that was elegant without being ostentatious, understated luxury that spoke of confidence rather than the need to impress. Ivy was waiting for him, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that somehow managed to look both professional and approachable. She smiled when she saw him, but Marcus could detect a hint of nervousness that matched his own. "Thank you for coming," she said, extending her hand in greeting. "I know this is all rather mysterious, but I wanted you to see something before. We talked about the job opportunity." She gestured for him to follow her through a set of double doors that opened into what was clearly the main office space. Marcus's first impression was of organized efficiency. Several workstations occupied by people who looked like they knew exactly what they were doing. Walls lined with architectural drawings and development plans, and a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a spectacular view of the city. "Welcome to Carter Development Group," Ivy said, watching his face carefully. "This is what I do for a living." Marcus took a moment to process what he was seeing. The scale of the operation was impressive. This wasn't just an office. It was the headquarters of what appeared to be a major real estate development company. He could see project timelines on whiteboards, scale models of building developments, and computer screens displaying what looked like financial projections with numbers that made his head spin. "You're a developer," he said, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "I'm the developer," Ivy corrected gently. Carter Development Group is the largest private real estate development company in the tri-state area. We've been responsible for about 60% of the major construction projects in Millbrook Heights over the past decade. Marcus stared at her, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he knew about Ivy Carter. He'd known she was wealthy, obviously, but this level of success was beyond what he'd imagined. "Let me show you something," Ivy said, leading him to a wall-mounted map of the city that was covered with colored pins and project markers. "Do you see the red pins? Those represent properties that Carter Development Group currently owns or has major stakes in." Marcus studied the map, his eyes widening as he took in the scope of what he was seeing. The red pins were everywhere: downtown office buildings, suburban shopping centers, residential developments, mixed-use complexes. It wasn't just that Ivy's company owned a lot of real estate. It was that they owned some of the most valuable and recognizable properties in the entire city, the Millbrook Towers. Marcus asked, pointing to a cluster of pins representing the luxury high-rise apartments that dominated the city's skyline. "Ours," Ivy confirmed. "The Heritage Mall? We developed it 15 years ago and still own a 40% stake." Marcus's finger moved to another section of the map, the Riverside Commerce Center, completed last year. It's one of our most successful projects. As the full scope of Ivy's business empire became clear, Marcus felt a combination of awe and disorientation. He was looking at a woman who didn't just have money. She had built an empire that had literally shaped the city where he'd lived his entire adult life. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Why are you showing me this?" Ivy walked to the conference room and gestured for him to follow. They sat across from each other at a polished table that probably cost more than Marcus's annual salary, and she opened a leather portfolio that contained what appeared to be detailed project plans. "Because I want to offer you a job that would actually use your background and experience," she said. "I've done some research on your work history, Marcus. Before your personal circumstances changed, you were a project manager at Millbrook Development Corporation. You coordinated multi-million-dollar construction projects. You managed teams of contractors and subcontractors. You had a reputation for bringing projects in on time and under budget." Marcus nodded slowly. It felt strange to be reminded of his previous professional life, which seemed like it belonged to a different person entirely. "I need someone with your skills," Ivy continued. "Someone who understands construction, who can manage complex projects, who has the integrity to handle significant responsibility. But more than that, I need someone I can trust, someone who shares my values about treating people fairly and building something that benefits the community, not just the bottom line." She opened the portfolio and slid a document across the table. To him, Marcus saw that it was a job description, complete with salary information that made him blink in surprise. "Senior Project Manager," he read aloud. "Oversight of residential and commercial development projects, coordination with architects, contractors, and municipal authorities. Salary range." He paused, reading the numbers again to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. "This is more than I made at my last job, significantly more. The role comes with benefits too," Ivy said. "Health insurance, retirement contributions, and a company car. Plus, you'd be working on projects that actually matter, affordable. Housing developments, community centers, green building initiatives. We're not just building for profit, Marcus. We're building for the future." Marcus stared at the job description, his mind racing. This wasn't just an opportunity to get back into project management. It was a chance to work at a level of responsibility and compensation that exceeded what he'd achieved before his life fell apart. "Why me?" he asked. "I mean, I appreciate the offer, but you could hire anyone. Someone with more recent experience, someone who hasn't been out of the field for 3 years. Ivy leaned forward, her expression serious. "Because character matters more than resume gaps. Because the way you handled that crisis at the lake, calm under pressure, decisive action, putting others' needs before your own safety, those are exactly the qualities I need in someone who's going to be making decisions that affect thousands of people's lives." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "And because I have a specific project in mind that I think would be perfect for you, something that would allow you to make a real difference in the community while proving to yourself that you're capable of much more than you've been allowing yourself to believe." Marcus looked up from the job description to meet her eyes. "What kind of project?" Ivy smiled, and for the first time since he'd entered the building, she looked completely relaxed. "Affordable housing development on the south side of town. 36 units designed for working families, single parents, seniors on fixed incomes, people who've been priced out of the housing market but still need safe, decent places to live. The kind of project that actually changes lives instead of just generating profit." Marcus felt something stir in his chest, a familiar excitement that he hadn't experienced in years, the kind of anticipation that came with the prospect of meaningful work, of building something that mattered. The position would start immediately, Ivy continued. You'd be working directly with our senior development team, but you'd have significant autonomy in how you manage the project. And Marcus? She leaned forward slightly. The housing development would be built on land that the company owns outright. Land that we've been holding for the right project, with the right person to manage it. Marcus realized that his hands were trembling slightly as he held the job description. This wasn't just a job offer, it was a complete transformation of his life's trajectory, a chance to regain his professional identity, to provide stability for Lily, to do work that mattered. There's one more thing, Ivy said, and something, in her tone, made Marcus look up sharply. Something I haven't told you yet about the scope of what Carter Development Group does, and why this job offer is about more than just giving you a career opportunity. She stood up and walked back to the city map, gesturing for him to join her. Marcus, when I said we own a significant portion of the real estate in this city, I wasn't exaggerating. Carter Development Group doesn't just develop properties, we own them. We're the landlords for thousands of residential units, the lessors for hundreds of commercial spaces. We have more influence over the housing market in this city than any other single entity. Marcus stared at the map, the full implications of what she was saying beginning to dawn on him. What I'm offering you isn't just a job, Ivy said quietly. It's a chance to help shape the future of this city, to make decisions that will affect how people live, where they can afford to live, what kind of community we're building for the next generation. She turned to face him directly, her expression intense. And Marcus, the man who jumped into a lake to save complete strangers, I think you're exactly the kind of person who should have that kind of influence. The room fell silent as Marcus processed what he'd just learned. He wasn't just being offered a job, he was being invited to join an organization that had the power to transform lives on a massive scale. And the woman who was offering him this opportunity owned more of his city than he'd ever imagined possible. The transformation he'd been hoping for was finally within reach. But as he looked at Ivy's expectant face, Marcus realized that accepting her offer would change not just his life, but potentially the lives of thousands of other people as well. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. Marcus stared at the city map for a long moment, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what Ivy had just revealed. The red pins seemed to multiply before his eyes as he began to truly understand what he was looking at. This wasn't just a successful business, it was an empire that touched virtually every aspect of life in Millbrook Heights. I need to sit down, he said quietly, and Ivy immediately guided him back to the conference room chair. I know it's a lot to take in, she said gently. When people hear real estate developer, they usually think of someone who builds a few houses or maybe a small shopping center. They don't realize that modern development companies can literally shape entire cities. Marcus looked up at her, a dozen questions racing through his mind. How long have you been building this? My husband and I started the company 12 years ago, Ivy said, settling into the chair across from him. David had inherited some property from his family, and we used that as seed capital to get started. But the real growth happened after he died. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the polished conference table. After David's funeral, I threw myself into work. It was the only way I could cope with losing him and still be present for the girls. I started acquiring properties that other developers were struggling with, problem projects, difficult sites, buildings that needed extensive renovation. I had this theory that if you could solve the problems everyone else was avoiding, you could build Something extraordinary. Marcus thought about his own response to tragedy, how he'd retreated from his professional life, accepted diminished circumstances, convinced himself that struggling was just his new normal. Ivy had responded to loss by building an empire. And it worked, she continued. Every project we completed successfully gave us credibility to take on bigger challenges. Every profit we made, we reinvested in new acquisitions. Within 5 years, we'd gone from a small family business to the largest development company in the region. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline that her company had helped create. But somewhere along the way, I realized that having this much influence over people's lives came with responsibilities I hadn't anticipated. When you own significant portions of a city's housing stock, when you control commercial development, when you're basically deciding what neighborhoods look like and who can afford to live in them, that's not just business. That's urban planning. That's social policy. Marcus followed her to the window, and for the first time since entering the building, he really looked at the view. From 42 stories up, Millbrook Heights spread out below them like a detailed model. He could see the neighborhoods where he'd grown up, the area where he lived now with Lily, the construction sites where he'd been working manual labor for the past 3 years. "Do you see that cluster of buildings near the lake?" Ivy asked, pointing to a section of the city that Marcus recognized as one of the most desirable residential areas. "Those are luxury condominiums that we developed 5 years ago. Beautiful units, excellent amenities, and completely unaffordable for anyone making less than 6 figures." Marcus nodded, remembering driving past those buildings and wondering what it would be like to live somewhere so elegant. "When we were designing that project," Ivy continued, "I was focused on maximizing profit. We built exactly what the market would bear at the highest possible price point. And you know what happened? We sold every unit within 6 months and made an enormous profit." She turned away from the window to face him directly. "But we also contributed to a housing crisis that's pushing working families out of the city. Teachers, firefighters, nurses, people who provide essential services can't afford to live in the communities they serve because companies like mine keep building luxury housing instead of affordable options." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly the problem he'd been living with for years, the sense that he was working harder and harder just to stay in place, that the city was changing around him in ways that made it increasingly difficult for people like him to survive. "That's why I want you to manage the affordable housing project," Ivy said. "Because I need someone who understands what it's like to be priced out of opportunities, someone who can build housing that actual working families can afford, someone who won't compromise on quality just because the residents aren't wealthy." Marcus looked out at the city again, seeing it now through completely different eyes. "How much of the residential housing do you own? In certain neighborhoods? 60 to 70%. In the city overall? About 35% of rental properties, and maybe 15% of the housing stock that's available for purchase." The numbers were staggering. Marcus tried to imagine what it would mean to have that kind of control over people's basic need for shelter. "Commercial real estate is even more concentrated," Ivy continued. "We own about half of the downtown office space, most of the major shopping centers, and significant portions of the industrial areas where manufacturing and warehouse jobs are located." She sat back down at the conference table, and Marcus joined her, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was learning. "Marcus, do you want to know the real reason I'm offering you this job? It's not just because I'm grateful for what you did at the lake, though I am. It's not just because I think you're qualified, though you are. It's because I need someone I can trust to help me figure out how to use this power responsibly." She opened another folder and spread out what appeared to be comprehensive development plans for several different areas of the city. "I've been working on something I call the Millbrook Heights Community Development Initiative. Instead of just building whatever generates the highest profit, I want to create developments that actually serve the community. Affordable housing mixed with market rate units, commercial spaces reserved for local small businesses instead of national chains, green spaces and community centers that bring people together instead of separating them by income level. Marcus studied the plans, recognizing immediately that they represented a completely different approach to urban development than anything he'd seen before. "This is incredible," he said slowly. "These mixed-income developments, the emphasis on community spaces, the environmental considerations, this is exactly the kind of development that cities need." "It's also risky," Ivy admitted. "Profit margins are lower, construction is more complex, and there's no guarantee that the community will embrace this kind of integrated approach to housing and development." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "But Marcus, if it works, if we can prove that responsible development can be both profitable and beneficial to the community, we could change how cities grow. We could create a model that other developers might follow. We could actually make a difference." Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that his work could matter beyond just providing a paycheck, that he could use his skills to solve problems that affected thousands of people. "There's something else," Ivy said, and her tone made Marcus look up sharply. "Something I need to tell you about why this project is so important to me personally." She pulled out a photograph from the folder, a picture of a modest apartment building that looked familiar to Marcus, though he couldn't immediately place it. "Do you recognize this building?" she asked. Marcus studied the image more carefully, and suddenly he felt a jolt of recognition. That's my building. That's where Lily and I live." Ivy nodded. "Carter Development Group purchased that property 6 months ago, along with 12 other apartment buildings in your neighborhood. We've been quietly acquiring residential properties in working-class areas throughout the city." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "Are you going to raise the rent? Are you going to force us out?" "No," Ivy said firmly. "Just the opposite. Those buildings are going to be the first phase of the Community Development Initiative. We're going to renovate them, improve the infrastructure, add amenities like playground equipment and community gardens. And we're going to keep the rents affordable for the families who already live there." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Marcus, I own the building where you live. I own the construction company where you work. I own the office building where you clean floors at night. For the past 3 years, without either of us knowing it, your rent payments, your construction wages, and your cleaning contract have all been coming from the same source. My company." Marcus stared at her, the full magnitude of the coincidence. Or perhaps it wasn't a coincidence, hitting him like a physical blow. "The night you saved my family," Ivy continued, "you weren't just saving strangers, you were saving the person who, without either of us realizing it, had been providing your livelihood for years. The person whose business decisions had been affecting your life in ways you never knew." The room spun slightly as Marcus tried to process this revelation. "You're saying that my entire life, my jobs, my housing, my financial struggles, it's all been connected to you. Connected to my company," Ivy corrected. "But yes, the low wages, the lack of benefits, the struggle to make ends meet, that's been the result of business decisions made by Carter Development Group. Decisions that I'm now in a position to change." She squeezed his hand gently. "Marcus, when you jumped into that lake, you saved the life of the one person who had the power to transform your circumstances. And you did it without knowing, without expecting anything in return, simply because it was the right thing to do." Marcus looked at her, understanding finally dawning. "That's why you're offering me this job. It's not just about giving me an opportunity. It's about making amends for years of decisions that kept me struggling. It's about recognizing that The man who would risk his life to save strangers deserves better than working 3 jobs just to survive, Ivy said. It's about understanding that if I have the power to change someone's life for the better, and that person has proven themselves to be exactly the kind of human being the world needs more of, then changing their life becomes my responsibility. She released his hand and sat back, her expression hopeful but uncertain. So, Marcus Wright, what do you say? Are you ready to stop just surviving and start building something extraordinary? Marcus looked out the window at the city below. His city, which he now understood in an entirely new way. The woman sitting across from him didn't just own buildings and businesses. She owned the infrastructure of opportunity itself, and she was offering to share that power with him. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Wright felt like his life was about to begin again. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same spot where Ivy had shown him the city map, but everything had changed. The wall now displayed the progress of the Millbrook Heights Community Development Initiative, with new pins marking completed projects, ongoing construction, and planned developments that would reshape entire neighborhoods. The affordable housing project that had started it all was nearly complete. 36 units of beautifully designed homes that working families could actually afford, surrounded by community gardens, playground equipment, and a small community center that was already hosting everything from job training classes to after-school programs. But the transformation went far beyond a single development project. Marcus had thrown himself into his new role with the passion of someone who'd been given a second chance at meaningful work. As senior project manager for community development, he'd overseen the renovation of the apartment building where he and Lily had lived, turning it from a rundown complex with maintenance issues into a model of affordable housing done right. The other tenants, families he'd known for years, had watched in amazement as their building received new windows, updated plumbing, fresh paint, and amenities they'd never dreamed of having. "Mr. Wright," Mrs. Rodriguez from down the hall had said to him just last week, "I don't understand how this happened, but my granddaughter can finally play outside safely. She has a real playground now, and I have a community garden where I can grow the vegetables my family needs. This feels like a miracle." Marcus had smiled, thinking about how many small miracles were possible when someone with resources decided to use them responsibly. Because that's what the past 6 months had taught him. That transformation wasn't just about individual success stories. It was about creating systems that lifted entire communities. The Community Development Initiative had expanded beyond anyone's initial expectations. What had started as a single affordable housing project had grown into a comprehensive approach to urban development that was attracting attention from city planners, policymakers, and other developers across the country. The mixed-income housing developments were proving that low-income, middle-income, and upper-income families could live in the same neighborhood successfully when the development was designed thoughtfully. The commercial spaces reserved for local businesses were creating entrepreneurship opportunities for residents who'd never had access to affordable retail space. The environmental features, solar panels, rain gardens, and green building materials were reducing utility costs for residents while setting new standards for sustainable construction. But perhaps most importantly, the initiative was proving that responsible development could be profitable. Carter Development Group's stock price had reached record highs as investors recognized that the company had discovered a model for growth that was both financially sound and socially beneficial. Marcus walked to his office, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city that still sometimes took his breath away. His desk was covered with architectural plans for the next phase of development, but he took a moment to look at the framed photograph that sat beside his computer. It was a picture from Lily's 8th birthday party, held in the community center of their newly renovated apartment complex. Four little girls, Lily, Sophie, Grace, and Emma, were blowing out candles on a cake that Ivy had insisted on having catered from the city's best bakery. Around them, a dozen other neighborhood kids were laughing and playing, their faces painted, with designs that Marcus had learned to create during his Wednesday evening volunteering at the community center. The party had been a revelation for Marcus. For the first time since his divorce, he'd been able to give Lily the kind of celebration he'd always wanted to provide, not just because he could finally afford it, but because they were part of a community that supported each other's children. "Daddy," Lily had whispered to him as they were cleaning up after the party, "I think this is the best birthday I've ever had. Not because of the cake or the presents, but because all my friends could come and their parents didn't have to worry about paying for anything." That conversation had crystallized something for Marcus about what real success looked like. It wasn't just about improving his own circumstances. It was about creating conditions where other people could thrive too. The sound of laughter from the hallway interrupted his thoughts, and Marcus looked up to see Ivy approaching his office, with the triplets in tow. It was a Saturday morning, and the girls often came to the office with their mother when she needed to catch up on work. But instead of being bored or restless, they'd become fascinated with the development projects, often spending hours studying the architectural models and asking detailed questions about how buildings were constructed. "Marcus," Ivy said as she entered his office, "the girls have something they want to show you." Sophie stepped forward, holding a poster board covered with drawings and what appeared to be a detailed written proposal. "We've been working on a project for school about community development, and we designed our own neighborhood." Marcus accepted the poster board, impressed immediately by the sophistication of their design. The girls had created a detailed layout for a mixed-use development that included housing, retail space, recreational facilities, and even a small urban farm. "This is incredible," Marcus said, studying their work. "You've thought about everything. Transportation, green space, different types of housing for different types of families. This is better than some professional proposals I've seen." Emma beamed with pride. "We learned about it from watching you and Mommy work, and we asked Mrs. Chen from the community center what kinds of things families need, and Mr. Rodriguez from the hardware store what kinds of businesses would work in our neighborhood." Grace added, "We want to build it for real when we grow up. We want to have a company like Mommy's, but instead of just making money, we want to make sure every project helps people." Marcus looked at Ivy, who was watching the exchange with an expression of pure maternal pride. Over the past 6 months, their professional partnership had deepened into something that felt like family. Not romantic love. Both of them were still healing from the losses that had shaped their recent years, but the kind of deep friendship and mutual respect that created unshakable bonds. "I think you might be raising the next generation of community developers," Marcus told Ivy. "These girls understand the connection between physical spaces and human well-being better than most adults." "They've had good teachers," Ivy replied, and Marcus knew she was talking about more than just their formal education. "Speaking of which, there's something I wanted to discuss with you." She waited until the girls had wandered off to examine the architectural models in the conference room before continuing. "I've been approached by a consortium of cities that want to replicate what we've done here in Millbrook Heights. They're offering to fund a consulting division of Carter Development Group that would help other communities implement similar community development initiatives." Marcus felt a familiar surge of excitement. "That's incredible. How many cities?" 12 to start with, but the potential is much larger. "We could be looking at a national model for responsible urban development." Ivy paused, studying his face. "The thing is, they want you to head up the consulting division. They specifically asked for the person who designed and implemented the Millbrook Heights model." Marcus sat back in his chair, processing what she'd just told him. "You're talking about expanding this work nationally. I'm talking about you becoming the leading expert in community-centered development in the United States, Ivy said. About your ideas and your approach being implemented in dozens of cities, affecting hundreds of thousands of people. The magnitude of the opportunity was overwhelming. Marcus thought about the apartment complex where he still lived, now renovated and beautiful, but still his choice because he wanted to remain part of the community he was helping to transform. He thought about the families whose lives had been changed by having access to affordable, high-quality housing. He thought about the small business owners who'd been able to open shops in the community commercial spaces, and the children who now had safe places to play and learn. There's one condition, Ivy continued. The consulting work would require significant travel, and it would mean spending time away from Lily. I know how important it is for you to be present for her, and I wouldn't want you to sacrifice that for professional opportunities. Marcus smiled, understanding once again why his partnership with Ivy worked so well. She never forgot that his priorities as a father came first. Actually, he said, I think this could be good for Lily too. She's been asking a lot of questions about different cities, about how other communities solve problems, about whether kids everywhere have the same opportunities she has now. Maybe it's time for both of us to see more of the world. Over the next hour, they outlined a plan that would allow Marcus to lead the consulting division while maintaining his responsibilities to his daughter and to the ongoing projects in Millbrook Heights. Ivy would handle the business development aspects of the expansion, while Marcus would focus on the technical and community engagement elements that had made their local initiative so successful. As they worked through the details, Marcus found himself thinking about the night that had started it all. The storm at Mirror Lake, the terrifying moments in the water, the decision to jump in without thinking about the consequences. He'd acted purely on instinct that night, driven by the simple belief that people should help each other when help was needed. He never could have imagined that single act of compassion would lead to this, to meaningful work that affected thousands of people, to financial security for his family, to a partnership with someone who shared his values and amplified his ability to make a difference. But perhaps more importantly, he never could have imagined how much his own understanding of success would change. The man who jumped into Mirror Lake had been focused on survival, keeping his head above water, making sure Lily had what she needed, getting through each day without falling further behind. The man sitting in this office 6 months later was focused on possibility, what could be built, what problems could be solved, what communities could become when people committed to working together. Late that afternoon, as the sun was setting over Millbrook Heights, Marcus and Ivy stood on the roof of the Carter Development Group building, looking out at the city they'd been reshaping together. The girls were playing a complicated game that seemed to involve both architecture and space exploration, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "Do you ever think about that night at the lake?" Ivy asked quietly. "Every day," Marcus admitted. "Not the scary parts, but the moment when I saw you and the girls and knew I had to help. It was the first time in years that I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I needed to do." Ivy nodded. "I think about it too, especially the part where you refused to take credit for what you'd done. Most people would have used that rescue as a stepping stone to something else. Media attention, recognition, opportunities. You just wanted to make sure we were okay and then go back to your normal life." She turned to face him directly. "I think that's why this partnership works so well. You never wanted anything from me except the chance to do meaningful work. And I never wanted anything from you except the chance to use my resources to support someone who would use them well." Marcus looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. Somewhere down there, families were settling into homes that were safe and affordable because of decisions made in this building. Children were playing in parks that existed because someone had chosen to prioritize community benefit over maximum profit. Small business owners were closing shops that were thriving because they'd been given access to reasonable commercial space in thriving neighborhoods. "You know what I realized?" Marcus said. "That night at the lake, I thought I was saving you. But I think maybe we saved each other." Ivy smiled, the kind of smile that contained multitudes, gratitude, friendship, shared purpose, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you've found your life's work. "I think you're right," she said, "and I think we're just getting started." As they gathered up the girls and prepared to head home, Marcus to his renovated apartment in the community he'd helped transform, Ivy to her house that was now regularly filled with the sounds of 4 children who'd become inseparable friends. Marcus reflected on the strange mathematics of kindness. He'd jumped into a lake to save 4 strangers, asking nothing in return. That single act had revealed a web of connections he never knew existed, transforming not just his own life, but the lives of thousands of other people who'd benefited from the community development work that followed. The ripple effects were still spreading. Other cities were preparing to implement similar initiatives. A new generation of children, including his own daughter, was growing up with a different understanding of what communities could be, and somewhere perhaps other people were learning that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simple decision to help when help is needed. 6 months ago, Marcus Wright had been a man drowning in circumstances beyond his control. Today, he was someone who helped design the very infrastructure of opportunity in his community. The transformation hadn't happened because he'd demanded it or because he'd been given what he deserved. It had happened because he'd done the right thing at the right moment, without knowing where it would lead. And as he tucked Lily into bed that night in their beautiful apartment, reading her a story about brave knights and kind princesses, Marcus understood that the most important lesson wasn't about real estate or development or even about how dramatically life could change. It was about the truth that Lily had always known, even when he'd forgotten it, that love and kindness create their own kind of magic, and that magic has a way of multiplying when you're brave enough to share it with the world. "Daddy," Lily said sleepily as he finished the story, "do you think Sophie and Grace and Emma will always be my friends?" "I think," Marcus said, kissing her forehead, "that some friendships are meant to last forever, especially the ones that start with people taking care of each other." As he turned off the light and headed to his own room, Marcus could hear the sound of the city outside his window, not the harsh noise of urban struggle, but the gentle hum of a community at peace with itself. It was the sound of transformation, of lives being lived with dignity and hope, of children growing up in neighborhoods where they were safe and valued. It was the sound of what happened when one person's courage created space for everyone else's dreams to flourish. And in the morning, he would wake up and continue the work of building a world where those dreams could become reality for even more families, in even more communities, for as long as his strength and vision could sustain the effort. Some stories begin with rescue. The best ones never really end. They just keep expanding, creating new chapters in the lives of everyone they touch, until the boundaries between who saved whom become impossible to define. Marcus Wright had jumped into Mirror Lake to save 4 strangers. In return, he discovered a life of purpose that he never could have imagined, and the water had given back everything he'd ever lost, plus more than he'd ever dared to hope for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.